Now, I did a video the other day about this hot mess of garbage, and some people came into the comments and said, no, you need to say more mean things about this because you haven't really done it yet. And I thought, well, okay, I'll do that then. Well, actually, what I mean is, this is my interpretation of it. What happened was, I put the video out, I got quite a lot of comments on it. It's all great, a lot of it was very positive. Some people said, oh, well, you know, I disagree. I love that aircraft, it looks beautiful. That's fair enough. I don't actually have any aesthetic opinion that I'm going to disagree with on this, but some people got a little bit trapped in their feelings and either got really kind of go America, like for some reason, like they took the angle that this was a brilliant aircraft and the only reason it went wrong was because everybody except the Americans was flying it wrong. That's a take. It's wrong, but it's a take. And also people got into it and came up with all kinds of excuses. Now there's that horrible conservative expression that gets bandied around a lot. Facts don't care about your feelings. So that's what this video is going to be. Basically, I'm going to go through a lot of these arguments that were put up and I'm going to discuss why a lot of them were actually incorrect. Now, I'll try not to be quite so tactless about it, but the fact is, you know, there's a lot of myths surrounding this aircraft and I think it's worth debunking them. But that said, at the same time, I am actually going to get into some of the positives about this and some of the things it achieved, because it did actually do some quite impressive stuff. And I think it's unfair to just focus on the negatives and not actually talk about some of the amazing things it did. This was an aircraft that involved the word "but" a lot. It was the first to make it to 120,000 feet, but it nearly killed Chuck Yeager in the process. It was the first to be fitted with the M61 Vulcan cannon, but the cannon had to be modified to be a linkless system because the Starfighter kept swallowing links in the air intakes and killing the engine. It was the fastest single-engine aircraft ever built, but it was entirely dependent on that engine, which had a habit of flameouts at high speed. It was challenging to restart, and if you couldn't, then the odds of landing successfully were very low. One quick side note worth a mention is that the Dyna-Soar program, spelt D-Y-N-A-S-O-A-R, it involved flying a modified 104, the NF-104A, which had a rocket mounted into the tail section. The aircraft would fly up to 35,000 feet and reach Mach 2, and at that point it would pull up into a 60-degree climb and fire off the rocket motor. At 68,000 feet, the engine was shut off and the aircraft would fly a parabolic arc, topping out at 120,000 feet. Now, for an aircraft that has pretty poor aerodynamic control at the best of times, being in the ultra-thin air of 120,000 feet doesn't give much for the control surfaces to work with. As described by Ed Dwight Jr., a test pilot on the program, this was a manoeuvre that caused the most accidents. At the top of the arc, you had a reaction control system, that's thrusters on the wingtips and nose, to get the aircraft into the right orientation for the descent phase. On top of that, the aircraft had to land at 300 miles an hour with no engine power, which is insane on an aircraft that specifically required engine power in order to remain aerodynamically functional. There were 3 of these aircraft in total, and all 3 were in significant accidents, though to be fair, the third one was stripped for parts, then those parts were attached to another F104, which then crashed. But it has to be said that this was far beyond what would be considered a normal aircraft manoeuvre. It would be inherently dangerous for any airframe. There was a joke about the program in general that it was the Dyna-Soar program, because the aircraft was trying really hard to make the pilots extinct. That said, of any airframe, this was the one job that the F104 was designed for. Nothing else had the power-to-weight ratio or ability to achieve what it did until much later when the MiG-25 beat it by less than 3,000 feet. Anyway, back on track, let's look at some of the comment nonsense. It was perfectly fine unless you used it for the wrong role. This came up a lot. The Starfighter was fine if you used it in its intended role, and other variations on the same theme. It was the Germans' fault for using it as a ground attack aircraft, aka flying it wrong, etc. Well, this one needs a little unpacking. Firstly, the F-104 was commissioned as an air superiority fighter. Kelly Johnson, the designer, spent time talking to Korean Sabre pilots, asking what they found hardest to combat with MiGs, and the answer was they can climb faster, so he fixed that problem. The problem for pilots in Korea was that experienced MiG-15 pilots knew that close-range, low-level, hard turning would be an easy win for their opposition. Some MiGs were even lost to propeller planes when they tried to get in close and low-speed dogfights. The best way for a MiG-15 to win was to take advantage of the superior climb and speed to use zoom and boom tactics, where the MiG would attack from high altitude and then scarper before the target aircraft could respond if they'd failed to hit it. So Kelly fixed the one problem. US fighters would now be zoomier and boomier than MiGs. It wouldn't matter that it would take forever to turn around after each zoom, only that during the zoom phase the aircraft would be stable and fast, and to that end it carried minimal avionics and weapon systems. Initially it was only the Vulcan M61 cannon, which was a significantly larger boom than previous aircraft, but also it quickly became apparent that they needed to strap at least a couple of the new Sidewinders on there. But the theatre was changing, low-level World War II style dogfights were out, intercepting Russian bombers was in, and the F-104 slotted into that role very well, especially in dry, calm air like the deserts of the US. So its first job change was actually a success, at least at first. The lack of targeting and fire control on board meant it wasn't really suited to Western-style interception. Ironically, it would have fitted right in alongside the MiG-21, with the way the Soviets were doing things using ground controllers to vector in interceptors, but for the USAF it was a no, so after a brief run it was retired. Roll on a couple of years and the US brought it back as a ground attack strike aircraft in Vietnam. It wasn't a huge success because of its very short loiter time and a turning circle the size of Texas, so it was no good for close air support. But it was good at dropping bombs on target. In a straight line attack it was very stable weapons platform and incredibly fast. It wasn't great at the job though, so the USAF swapped it back into air combat. This was the F-104C version, so the US were also using it for the wrong job. Corruption and politics aside, the F-104G was meant to address the lessons learned in Vietnam and fix all of those issues. Needless to say, it didn't. And while Germany had the highest losses, it wasn't the only one flying it in this role. The Canadian, Italian, Belgian, Netherlands, Taiwanese militaries all used the F-104G in ground attack roles, so it wasn't just the Germans flying it wrong. The Germans did crazy things like attach it to a rocket launcher. Well, okay, yes, they experimented with the F-104G ZEL. ZEL stands for Zero Length Launch, but so did the Americans, the Russians, the Canadians with various aircraft. The Americans were the ones to try it first, including with an F-104G. Fortunately, there were no accidents, and the idea was scrapped as it became obsolete before prototyping was even complete. If you want a jet that takes off vertically, get a Harrier. They just didn't know how to use it. Now there's a drop of truth in this, but only in so much as it was incredibly easy to get it wrong. It was as solid as a rock in high-speed, straight flight, but beyond that it was just waiting for an excuse to retire pilots. For example, it suffered really badly from adverse yaw and from inertial coupling. As soon as you tried to apply roll to the aircraft, you got it angry, and it might try and make you regret your career choices. But the most terrifying thing was that at low level, for example landing, it had a bucket load of things that could ruin your day and margins of error that were as slim as a 90s supermodel. One of its issues was a very poor lift force from its wings, which meant that you had to land at high speed, or your sink rate would be too high and you'd hit the ground too hard. It did have some clever engineering to help mitigate this in the form of blown flaps. This is where gases from the engines are redirected and blown over the top surface of the flaps to create more lift in the wings. The trouble is, this solution created a whole bunch of new risks. For one, the engines had to be run at a minimum of 83% to produce enough gas for the effect to be of use. So now you're back to landing with a lot of engine power on and a lot of speed. But the biggest risk was that this blown flap effect only activated at full flaps, so the difference in lift between full flaps and one notch down was very significant. This is a big problem if one of the valves is stuck and only one wing gets blown. The aircraft would suddenly and violently roll, which at low altitude just before landing is considered suboptimal. Pilots were taught to assume that one or other valve would be stuck and to be ready to immediately drop the flaps back a notch at any hint of a roll. This was by far not the only way the F-104 would turn on you. It was known by some pilots as a bucket of gotchas. Another example is the stators in the J79 engines. These engines went on to be very effective, but in the F-104As, the stators were designed to be adjustable in pitch. The problem was they would jam open, or worse, closed, and cause the engine to fail, especially in hot environments. 10 of the 13 F-104s that crashed in Spain were due to engine malfunction, several of them from this very era, causing them to crash on or shortly after takeoff. And yes, starfighters did crash in Spain, we'll get to that in a minute. While there is truth to the idea that German pilots lacked specific airframe training, it wasn't just rookie pilots getting caught out by these gotchas. Flying an aircraft a gnat's wang away from disaster in rough northern European weather took down a lot of experienced pilots too. Well, Spain never lost any. So yes, about that, this one came up a lot, but this is a flex that relies heavily on statistical tomfoolery. Sure, the Spanish never lost an airframe, they flew it as an interceptor and in generally in ideal conditions. But in Spanish territory, the USAF lost 13 airframes, which is more than half the total number of airframes the Spanish had. Also, the USAF losses were to aircraft operating from Spanish air bases. Given that the Spanish had such a small number of aircraft and that almost all the losses were to mechanical failure, it seems more likely that the Spanish got lucky rather than any other factor. Also of note, a variation on this is the, well, America didn't lose as many aircraft. Just like the Spain example, this kind of relies on you not knowing that Germany had nearly 3 times as many F104s as America, and as a percentage of total airframes, lost significantly less. When you look at it as Germany lost around 25% of its aircraft, and the US lost 50% of its aircraft, it doesn't quite paint the same picture. The US lost 150 airframes to all causes out of around 300, depending if you count prototypes and experimentals or not. It's not like the corruption scandal was all that bad, they would have bought it anyway. Well, we'll never know if it really affected sales that much, but chances are it did. Kelly Johnson threatened to quit when he found out about it. He was so disgusted in the company. The man that created Skunkworks and gave you things like the SR-71. Not something he'd do if they were no worse than the other company. You can't really prove this one way or the other, but the evidence suggests that the Lockheed scandal went way above and beyond anything any other company was doing. It looks beautiful and you're just being mean. Okay, fair. I'm not actually telling anyone how they should feel about it. I can see how some people might like its lines and styling, and I'm not making content to tell people what to think or appreciate. I'm just talking about the history and data of this airframe, though I accept through the lens of disliking it. It's in my top 5 most disliked aircraft. It doesn't have to be on your list, and that's okay, but if you have to fudge facts to make a point, it's not a great point you're making. Thanks for watching.